Hundreds of Iran-backed Iraqi fighters crossed into Syria Monday to help the government fight rebels who seized Aleppo last week. But Reuters does report as of now, Lebanese Hezbollah has no plans to join them as their war with Israel does continue. The rebel storm of Aleppo is the biggest success in years for the fighters who are against Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. Government forces held complete control of Aleppo since capturing what was then Syria's largest city. That was back in 2016, and the siege was one of the major turning points of the war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. I want to dig a little bit deeper into all of this and really a look at how it started. So let's bring in Bill Roggio, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies and editor of the Foundation's Long War Journal. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Well, first off, I want to go back in time a little bit because a lot of people have seen this kind of develop over the last several days, but this is more than a decade in the making. Can you explain to me exactly what has been going on from the get-go?
Yeah, this is a conflict of a decade and a half in the making. With the advent of the so-called Arab Spring, you had anti-Assad elements and then jihadist elements, including al-Qaeda, that rose up against Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, his regime. And they began taking over large chunks. Of course, there was the split between al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Then the Islamic State took over large portions of Syria. The Assad regime really was on its back foot. It received support from Russia and Iran, its two key allies, and then the Iranians pumped in Hezbollah from Lebanon, as well as the Iraqi militias that it established to help beat back some of the jihadist elements and the so-called Free Syrian Army, which is a very problematic force. And by, I'd say, the late 2010s, this conflict stabilized. The Assad regime regained control of places like major cities like Aleppo, whereas the U.S.-backed, ironically named Syrian Democratic Forces, which is really the PKK or the Kurdistan Workers' Party, this is a foreign terrorist organization. The U.S. backed them. They took control of some areas in the north. And then groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which used to be al-Qaeda's branch in Syria and still has ties to al-Qaeda, consolidated in Idlib. And then Turkey also got into the fray because the Turks don't like the Kurds. And their aspirations for an independent country. They backed what's now called the Syrian National Army, and they control areas in the north. So you essentially have a crazy Game of Thrones situation in Syria where there are no good actors. There is no one that we really should be rooting for.
How significant overall is the rebel capture there of Aleppo? Is that something, it sounds as though it came as a surprise.
Yeah, it certainly was a surprise. This wasn't done in a vacuum. So the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the main group in conjunction with the Syrian National Army. They launched the offensive. Aleppo is the second largest city in Syria. So this is a major prize. HTS or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was confined to Idlib in northwestern Syria. And the Syrian National Army also confined to the north. I don't think it's an accident that this offensive was launched. The two groups in conjunction. HTS has received support from the Turkish government as well. I suspect that Turkey coordinated these actions. The Syrian National Army isn't going to do anything without Turkish support. And, I'm watching videos of the fighters from both groups. They're well armed. They have new uniforms, they have new weapons, some, sophisticated weapon systems. In my experience, watching the Taliban when they did this sort of thing, it was when they got backing from a state. And I suspect that these groups took advantage of Russia being engrossed in the conflict in Ukraine and Iran being distracted in supporting Hezbollah and supporting Hamas and the Houthis. And, my guess is that the Turks saw an opportunity here, pointed their militias, their weapons at this Assad regime, who was probably very complacent at this point, given there hasn't been major fighting. And so they saw a target of opportunity and they took it.
We know, of course, Lebanese Hezbollah is involved in the fighting with Israel, so they're a little preoccupied at this point. And as I mentioned, they have no plans to go into Syria and get involved. But overall, I want to get your take here. Do we expect that all of this going on in Syria will have any sort of impact on the situation in Lebanon or in Gaza?
So, and to the point about Lebanese Hezbollah not being involved, what Iran is doing is taking those Iraqi-backed militias, which are larger in number, but not as well trained, not as sophisticated as Hezbollah. But that's exactly what the Syrian regime needs. They need foot soldiers. They need bodies to throw at this offensive. So, and these militias, these Iraqi militias, haven't been used or utilized significantly against Israel. So I don't think this is going to have a major impact on Israel's war with Hezbollah or in Gaza against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But it does take some of Iran's focus and energy away from supporting the, Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis. Iran is juggling a lot of balls right now, and this is just something, it adds a degree of difficulty. I think it's one that it can manage, but anytime you can spread a group thin, or you could spread Iran thin, that's probably a good thing for Israel. But I would say in the long run, if Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, it's a Salafist jihadist group that has no love for Israel. If it is able to overthrow the Assad regime, which I don't think is likely, but it certainly isn't beyond the realm of possibility, it would be very hostile to Israel.
Is there any sort of U.S. involvement in that situation developing in Syria? There's no question they are very involved, the U.S., in the situations with Israel. But what about with Syria?
U.S. support in Syria goes back to that Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the PKK or the Kurdistan Workers' Party. That's who the U.S. picked sides with in the Syrian civil war. They're limited in what they can do. And the SDF right now is fighting against the Syrian National Army. Again, the Syrian National Army supported by the Turks. The Turks despise the PKK, and for good reason. Again, a terrorist organization responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Turkish civilians. Not that I have any love for the Turkish government, but they do have a good beef on this one. So that's where the U.S. is really. It's not going to get. I hope not. Look, the best thing the U.S. can do is just sit back and watch all of its enemies go after each other and weaken each other. The U.S. does not and should not have a dog in this fight, other than it could possibly weaken the Assad regime, raise the costs for Iran doing business in Syria, for the Russians doing business in Syria, for the Assad regime. But we really shouldn't be picking sides. It would be great if everyone could lose.
My last question for you here, what should we be watching for as this does progress? What is next? What do we need to keep our eyes on?
Yeah, one of my concerns would be the collapse of the Assad regime. Again, not that I would like to see the Assad regime remain in power, but we do not want to see a jihadist organization like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham gain access to complicated weapon systems or the chemical weapons that the Assad regime still possesses. And in that case, that would be the only instance where I would support U.S. involvement in this war, and that would be to secure those weapon sites and destroy the chemical weapons. Israel probably would have interest in that as well. But yeah, I think that's really what we need to monitor, how Iran is able to muster the Iraqi militias, as well as there's Pakistani and Afghan militias and Qatari militias as well. That will be interesting to watch more. That's more of professionally. I'm interested in seeing how Iran is able to muster these militias, because I believe at one point in time, these militias, which have largely stayed out of the war with Israel, will be pointed at Israel at some point in time.
All right, Bill Roggio, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and break it all down. Obviously, a very involved and complicated situation we'll be keeping our eyes on. Anything else you want to add before I let you go?
No, I think we captured it all. This is like, I just would like to reiterate that, we should not be looking to pick winners in this fight. They're all bad actors. And sometimes the best policy is to do nothing. We have a tendency as Americans to think that we could fix every problem. And I think if we should have learned anything from the war on terror, we couldn't fix Iraq. We couldn't fix Afghanistan. Maybe we could have, but we didn't have the will to see these wars through. We need to be very careful about any future wars that we get involved with. If we are going to put American boots on the ground, it should be for a very decisive victory and not this management of conflicts, because that is a major disservice to our American soldiers and their families.
All right, Bill, thank you again for being here with us today. We appreciate it. And if we don't see you, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.
Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and a Happy New Year's to you and your watchers. Thank you.